Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural Red Canary happy hour. Not happy hour. This is office hours. But the
They're
wrong
still
part.
happy.
Brains in the wrong part of the day already. Thank you for coming. I'm Keith McCammon. I'm one of the founders here at Red Canary. Allow Dave to introduce himself.
I'm Dave Farrow. I am the CISO and head of IT here at Red Canary. I'm also a longtime happy customer of Red Canary, so I'm excited to be here talking with one of the founders.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, Adam, I think we can close out the poll. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to vote. You'll understand the importance of the relevance of that later. So without further ado, we're going to jump ahead to the docket for this week. And so we've got a few things on the list. Every week, we want to try to deliver a mix of like operational or intelligence insights, so the things we're seeing inside of our SOC, things we're learning either from industry or from the work that we're doing to protect customers. And then we've got a discussion topic, which this week is going to be DeepSeek and a little bit of as like a entree into AI risk. And that's kind of dominated the news in the last week. And it's been cool. It's been some fairly, it feels like a series of interesting late breaking developments. So we're going to dive right in. And first thing we want to do, and for those of you who are new to Red Canary, or at least new to our content, every month our intelligence team puts out a list of the top threats that we've seen over that past month. And so if you're familiar with our annual threat detection report, think of this as the month over month trends, things that are kind of breaking, emerging threats. Sometimes, and you'll see, if you're looking at this list, some of these names will look really familiar. Some of these things stay on here and have stayed on here for many months or over a year. So if you haven't already, one of the best things to do is go ahead and subscribe. You can follow the link in chat. We'll also put it up at the end. But get subscribed to that. That'll give you these every single month for one of these office hours that coincides with our Intel Insights. We'll make sure to break those down. And so this being the first, we want to take an opportunity to highlight and talk you through some new research that you may not have seen. This is a threat called Tangerine Turkey. It was discovered by our team late last year, and this month, for the first time, broke into the top 10 threats that we've seen. And so it's a worm that was discovered by us. It's delivered via USB, and we'll talk some more about that in a second. And it's observed delivering crypto mining malware. And this is another really important point that we'll dig into in a second, but capable, obviously, of delivering arbitrary payloads. And so in a little bit more detail, this is how the Tangerine Turkey worm works. And so uses DLL hijacking as a later stage technique. But as I mentioned before, that delivery is via USB. They use VB script and some other scripts to create staging directories that are named to look very similar to the ones that are already on the system. So in this case, they're creating a system32 directory with a space before it. And then they drop a legitimate but vulnerable executable file, a DLL, and some configuration files into that staging directory. And they use DLL sideloading. And the ultimate goal there, again, today is cryptocurrency mining, sometimes overlapping with XMRig and sometimes not. And so I definitely encourage you, if you haven't already, like go check that out on the blog. Steph Rand on the Intel team did an absolutely awesome job breaking this down in a YouTube video that walks through like how exactly this works in a lot more detail. So, but
So many questions about this. Like the first thing that jumped out when I saw this was, I mean, really, we're still dealing with USB worms. This is still requiring us, and this is why we put that poll up at the beginning, right? Is because are we still seeing malware transmitted by USB device? And my first question about that is like, how fast or how slow does a worm like that travel, right? I mean, and why are we still using USBs today? Right, when I think about why I used USBs for years, the current collaboration tools have made it virtually, well, not just virtually unnecessary. I haven't used a USB drive in years. And so I'm curious who these guys are going after and who has the time to wait for a worm like that to spread. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you mentioned it when we were kind of reviewing this during the prep. It's a long game, right?
Right.
This is not a get rich quick scheme, right? Adam, if you don't mind, could you pop up the poll results? I am kind of curious, what that looks like. All right, there we go. So we've got literally about a dead even split, which is wild. Thanks, Adam. Appreciate that.
So I'm curious. Thank you guys for answering that. I would love to hear in the comments, for those of you that still allow unrestricted USB device access, is there a business requirement that necessitates that, or is this a case where either culture or other barriers make it really difficult to disable that? Um, because as long as there are valid business cases for the use of these devices, worms like this are going to have an opportunity to spread.
Yeah.
Um, but as we talked about, like how slow those things go, the other interesting part was the fact that we're really primarily only seeing this doing crypto mining. And if you've got something that's propagating slowly and is doing crypto mining on just a small set of or a relatively small number of infected devices, the question arises, how much do I care about that, right? And I think where we went was that anytime you've got malware on your machine that's communicating back to a command and control, anyone that's in a long game like this is almost certainly going to provide some way of updating their malware, right? And if it's updatable, then that can turn into a much more virulent form of malware on your machine pretty quickly if the people controlling it decide that it's time to do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll take a little bit of take a brief detour. This is, I guess, like, Red Canary lore, but we do a ton of work and put a lot of time and energy into like software baselining, and in particular, trying to find, classes of tools like remote monitoring management tools. Unwanted software in particular is a big one. And so, uh, we get questions about that pretty frequently. It's like, why, you know, I don't care about unwanted software. I want you to stop telling me about this. And we've put dials into the product over time to make that easier. So like folks can adjust that to their risk tolerance. But the underlying principle that I think you just alluded to is the reason we always focused so much on it, and the reason why it's like, at least from my perspective, it's like one of these cybersecurity hills that I'll die on, because the payload today is crypto mining, but by definition, if they can put anything there they want, they can put anything there they want, right? And so, we mentioned it. Crypto mining seems like a slow game. USB propagation is not optimized for speed, but those are also dials that the adversary has to turn, right? So I think that's the thing we want to make sure we account for, is like, if they can get software on that system, that payload can change in a moment's notice. And so I think that's super important. Uh, Catching up on chat here, and go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Yeah. Before I get to Ryan's question here, I wanted to call out here Raul's out there. I still use USB drives to store offline data. I think so. We do that. We do that too. And that's where the control around whitelisting specific devices comes from, right? You create controlled devices that you're allowed to use for that type of offline backup, and that really does mitigate this type of attack. Um, Keith, I'm curious what your thoughts are on Ryan's question before I give my thoughts on it.
Yeah. That's a good, we didn't talk about that, and we kind of skipped over. I think, Dave, this is one of the, along with you shaking your fist and saying who's still using USB, and which is a fair question. I think one of the, probably like a huge aspect of this to keep in mind is like the types of environments, and this isn't all the places where we see it, but you can probably imagine where this is concentrated. And I would say manufacturing is a really good example. Older system profiles, you don't have all of the modern controls available that you do in an enterprise environment, which I think is kind of what Ryan's alluding to there. This is definitely going to be concentrated in those environments that are running older operating systems on older hardware. Um, we sometimes make like a little bit of a sad joke, but the things that will survive, like nuclear fallout, will be, USB keys and configure, right? And so like those are the types of threats that linger and like really long tail in those types of environments. I'm not sure how big of an issue this is in like modern enterprises. Dave, I don't know, you probably know a
Yeah,
lot more about
it
that.
feels that way to me too. This feels like it's aimed at older environments that typically are less well governed. Uh, didn't you say that we're seeing this activity in different environments that are generally older?
I
That's
think
what we can talk about.
traditionally, and like I'm less up to speed on all of the, I'd say like the targeting, or this is probably a little bit more opportunistic with this threat in particular. But if you're familiar with like Raspberry Robin, which is a similar USB born threat that we've been tracking for years, like that was the same thing. Like overwhelmingly, that gets observed in environments where you do kind of have that long tail of both hardware and software. Um, and it's, either because of some of those externalities or because those tend to be like also larger, somewhat sprawling organizations, right? They just like controls across the board are not where you would expect them to be, like in a really modern enterprise.
Right.
Uh, I want to walk through some of these too, and we kind of already touched on, I think, those first two, and I think those first two are, to Ryan's point over there in the comments too, like those are, I think the going in position today for everyone is like those things should be not allowed by default. And if they are allowed, it should be, an explicitly authorized device by a particular user for a particular reason. These recommendations at the bottom are some of the ones, and like this is how our team finds and tracks these things. But you can do this on your own if you have to, like investigating unexpected use of file copy utilities. So, you know, I'd say I'll speak for Dave. Like I guess that across most of Red Canary's user base, you don't have a lot of people doing command line copy and pretty like bulk copy of files and things like that. Or if you do, it's probably contained to a particular like, subset of your audience. Um, the second one is a little bit trickier to keep an eye on, but if you're able to do that, just looking for known files, and you can do that by signer and things like that, but in non-standard paths. And so, like the reason that this and a whole bunch of other threats like this work, um, are taking like things that are already allowed to run in most cases things that are on the system, but they relocate them to a place like in this case where they can also put a DLL alongside it that they can sideload. And so um, it's a little bit of living off the land, but like with a twist. And every time the adversary has to do that, every time they've got to relocate something, like that's an opportunity for us. And then uh, the really big one I want to call attention to is like we have seen this used in conjunction with XMRig, which is a really big global, like globally deployed crypto mining like platform or suite, if you will. And so there's a bunch of great research from Red Canary and a whole bunch of other folks on XMRig, and so that's another opportunity, um, like a little bit less, or like a little bit less esoteric than implementing some of these other like detection methodologies. Dave, anything you kind of add here before we move on?
I guess as a shameless plug, and as a happy Red Canary customer, I really have focused all of my effort on the first two bullets as the person responsible for protecting Red Canary, because the service does those last four for me. And so I don't have to read below the fold for a lot of this stuff, because that's part of what you expect an MDR to do for you.
Yeah. And I'd say, to be fair too, I think modern EDR and modern XDR platforms too, I think you can increasingly or should increasingly expect to do
Right.
some of that lifting in the bottom as well.
Right.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. I want to cover one more threat, and we're going to do this one really briefly because this is a couple months old, but so I really want to go through it fast just to call everyone's attention to it. Um, and so this is a financially motivated threat actor that was discovered around April of last year. It's been covered, talked about, and researched pretty extensively by us and other firms. Uh, but around same time frame as Tangerine Turkey, November of last year, we started seeing this particular set of activity. And this one's unique, and I really just want to call attention to it so folks can do their own reading and their own research. But this one's unique in that these folks are getting flooded with an inbox full of email, um, mostly junk. And but when I say flooded, you'll kind of see on the next screen, like it's pretty overwhelming in that like the actual inbox is not really visible. And so the ruse here is that these folks just get bombed with trash email. And then helpfully someone from IT comes along and says, hey, like we know a whole bunch of folks are getting their inboxes bombed. You could join this team session and I'm going to help you through it. And at that point, a somewhat predictable series of events occurs, right? They drop some software on the system and then end up with ransomware. Um, so over here on the right, this was shared by like a healthcare coordination firm. And so you can kind of just get a sense for what that looks like. And again, I think the main reason for calling attention to this, and like Dave would love your perspective
Mhm.
here, and we'll do the 30 seconds or less version. Um, this one to me is unique almost entirely because you look at things like Tangerine Turkey, and we can deal with those overwhelmingly with technical controls. And like most of the kind of like persistent, really thorny challenges, like this is different, right? Like this one plays directly to my desire to get back to work when I can't find my email in my own inbox.
Right. So this one's actually an interesting attack. I spent a number of years in the email security business, and there was a debate that I don't think has ever really been resolved around what the difference between spam and ham is. And there are real penalties to the spam and virus, filtering tools if they block stuff that they shouldn't block. And so if you've got stuff that are like you sign up for a lot of newsletters, it's really hard to argue that those are malicious in any way. And so this is effectively an email or an inbox DOS that you're not going to realistically expect an email security solution to solve for you. And so the thing to watch out for is that even if you're being DOSed in your inbox, if somebody initiates a call to you to support you, be suspicious. It's pretty much always a bad deal.
Yep. And again, this is and we won't go through all the recommendations here, but in this case, again, like yes, there are technical controls, but I think this one has like continues to be thorny for that very reason is like you have to have that conversation with people. It has to sink in. But most importantly, like all of the great scams, right? Like they prey on urgency and they prey on your desire to just be able to get back to work or whatever it is you're doing. And so you can read more about that online. Again, we're not going to spend more time there. I want to jump right in the interest of time into this week's discussion topic. And so, for those who haven't been following along, that seems impossible. But DeepSeek is an AI model and a company launched. It's been around for a long time. It's kind of a somewhat of a not a complex, but it's a long story. But this was an AI model and company like launched. It's China based. Uh, its pedigree is financial services, like as a hedge fund or a trading firm, and so really kind of hit the street last week. And uh, this was there was a little bit of a stock market dip. Really started to the cost and the speed with which DeepSeek was built and launched really caused people to call into question the massive amount of money and time and energy, say investment broadly, that's being put into doing the same thing with through these U.S. based companies, OpenAI, Perplexity, folks like that, right? And so, um, so we want to talk through this. And when DeepSeek came out, the initial reaction and let's say the thing that overwhelmingly like really got people's like ears perked up was the fact that like this is a Chinese based SaaS application. And there's a lot more to DeepSeek than that. And so we'd like, we'll break that down. Um, but that was really the big thing, right? And so like, Dave, when we talk about this, it's like there's a whole bunch of risk that's balled up inside of AI, right? Like every kind of like
Right.
rock you turn over there, like it's very multidimensional, but that's the big one, right?
Yeah,
Like that was
what's interesting about the kerfuffle that DeepSeek is causing is that it's causing us to have the conversations we should have been having all along. Because when you attach China to it, you attach probably greater consequences to the risks materializing, but the risks that DeepSeek poses are not net new to the whole AI charge right now, right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think that's, we kind of talk about that geopolitical twist. I remember I'll date myself a little bit here, but like I draw a lot of parallels between what's happening today with AI and what happened when the iPhone came out, which is that like a thing comes out that everyone uses and loves and makes them more productive, and they are going like they are going to find their way to it, right? And so like that risk has always existed. How you control what we put into it has always existed. There is an interesting thing that we talked through. So, like, Dave, you really kind of pressed on this
Right.
initially, which was, hey, can't you just use the model locally? And the answer to that is yes. And that comes with some risks. And one of the things that I unearthed yesterday, and I'm not sure if you've seen this. So I think the very specific thing that you called out when we were kind of talking through this topic was, hey, how can you trust that all these wrappers and things like Olama, like that whole supply chain of tools and utilities that make it really fast and easy to use a model locally? How do you trust those? And so that link over in the
Right.
chat there is an awesome piece of research that I just stumbled upon where someone is doing precisely the thing you pointed out, which is like everything I type in, my access tokens, my queries that I think are local are not.
Right. Yeah, with that line of reason was triggered. I read a LinkedIn post where someone was asserting that LLMs are mathematical models. They can't drop malware, they can't drop backdoors. And so I went out and I looked at the open source repo for DeepSeek. And if you pull any of these things down, whether it's from GitHub or Hugging Face, there's some amount of Python code involved in those things. And as soon as you're pulling down somebody else's Python code, it's the same. You have the same risks that you have when you pull open source code from anywhere. You need to vet what's in there, and when you just look at the sheer number of models that have been dropped on Hugging Face, I think it's going to be a while before we really catch up and are comfortable that those things are safe to just pull down.
Yep.
And that needs to be part of our risk model when we think about running these things locally.
Yeah. So speaking of models, I'm gonna jump into this because um, this might look like it took more than 5 minutes to make, but it didn't. And this was like quite literally like I think these are like my notes when I was like, hey Dave, like walk me through how we think about all the different usage patterns, and in particular, like the different risks associated with AI. And I think this was, and by the way, if anybody in the chat like has similar models or would like to kind of talk through this or aspects of this that that really speak to you or that you'd like to challenge, like this would really love to take questions here. Um, but maybe just if you don't mind, just walk us through this at a high level, just like it was kind of that big like those big buckets of like usage patterns, I'd say.
Yeah. So the three that we've identified, if you start with the cloud hosted models, those are things like Chat GPT, where there's a web interface for interacting with it. And when you interact with something like that, you're going to have data privacy and sovereignty concerns. Um, I think for personal use, there's a lot of flexibility to avoid vendor lock-in. But if you build any of your processes around those types of things, you're gonna have to deal with vendor lock-in, and you have to worry about how those vendors are going to use your data and whether they're going to train your data on or their model on your data. And so the general thought is, hey, let's just host this ourselves and run it locally. And in doing that, there are a couple different ways that you can do that. You can pull down ready-made models, or you can develop models yourself. But when you end up doing either the hosting yourself models, you're going to solve some of the data privacy and sovereignty problems, probably a lot of those data sovereignty and privacy problems, at the cost of the operational expense of keeping those things running, and having staff that knows how to operate those things.
Yeah, and the farther to the right you go, it's we kind of mentioned convenience here, and control at the bottom is kind of like that sliding scale, but cost is probably the single biggest one, right? Like cost of adoption over on the left is you know as close to zero as
Right.
it can get, and can be pretty incremental. And the farther right you go, you're making, you're making some really big investments, and you've got to, with all things, it's a trade-off.
Right. And I think the other thing that we called out that doesn't necessarily show up here is as we're thinking through our own approach to AI here. We actually have, it's helpful to me to think about it in different domains. When I think about providing AI services for individual productivity, things like G Suite's Gemini are really appealing, because you do have contractual protections to not train the global data set from your data, and you do have a lot of the protections that you would get by hosting it locally. But when I think about the information that I would want to apply generative AI to, or data sets that I would want to ask questions about, not all of it lives in G Suite. Some of it lives in our CRM. Some of it lives in places like Atlassian. And you end up getting sort of tool scatter.
Yeah.
And so that second domain, the first domain is personal productivity. The second domain is how do you do personal productivity across your business applications. And then, when you're talking about using AI and building AI into your product, you kind of have to go into that column on the right.
And one thing I put a little red box around, you almost can't talk about this for more than 30 seconds without kind of circling back to like that data privacy, data sovereignty, like who has access to the things that I type or that I submit to this product, like this model. And so one of I think just an hour before we jumped on here, Perplexity, so one of the, like one of the large like SaaS based AI firms, announced now that they've got DeepSeek R1 available in the Perplexity platform, hosted entirely on systems in the EU and US. And so that was an interesting twist where kind of you think about this, and, a lot of those, I'd say if there's like a risk that people seem to be focusing on much more than others, it is that concept of data privacy and data sovereignty. And like, if some employee goes and takes and puts sensitive information in there, like who's going to have access to that, and do you have any hope of controlling it? And so I thought that was an interesting kind of twist in development, is that that spent the last week really just like collectively freaking out about DeepSeek, either because of the market impact or because of the data privacy and sovereignty concerns. And now Perplexity comes out today and gives the people what they want, right? Which is the ability to use this new shiny model in a way that is, conventional cloud hosted SaaS safe, in the same way that we think about OpenAI and Copilot. So, we're at time. I don't see any questions over here on the left for this last section, but want to thank everyone for coming. Like, really appreciate it. It's the first of these, so everyone will be getting a poll afterwards. We very, very much appreciate your feedback. That'd be wildly valuable. Would like to make each one of these like more valuable and information dense than the one before it. So thanks everybody. Have a terrific day. Subscribe to the blog if you haven't already. We'll be making sure to recap this stuff, and you'll see a best of. And in addition to that, you'll have access to all of our breaking research and intelligence moving forward. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Keith.
It's been a pleasure. Look forward to the next one.
Yep. Same here.
Cheers.